While we're talking alternative shells for Windows, it's about time to have a look at one of the major players of the time, the Norton Desktop for Windows, which also saw a release for DOS. Retrocomputing is the use of older computer hardware and software in modern times. I'm the vintage collector, and these are my stories. The Norton Desktop was introduced in June 1991 as an alternative shell to Windows 3.1, greatly enhancing from the stock Windows capabilities. Sources on the internet are unclear whether Peter Norton's company, formerly known as Peter Norton Computing, that was acquired in 1990 by Symantec, was now called Peter Norton Computing Group or Peter Norton Consulting Group. But it seems logical that the Norton Desktop was developed after the acquisition by Symantec. Personally, I have only faint memories of Norton Desktop. I remember my dad used it for a period before switching over to OS2 2.0, so it's only today, some 33 years later, that I'm revisiting the Norton Desktop. It saw several releases for Windows in the period between 1991 and 1993, and even 2 releases for DOS. At least as of this source here, there seemed to be as well a version for the Macintosh, though I was unable to acquire it. Already during the installation, you get a glimpse that the Norton Desktop comes with a backup program, as you're being asked whether to run a scheduled backup. And of course, let's not forget to activate the Norton Desktop as the default shell. And this is what it looks like upon startup. The quick access mimics the look and feel of the program manager with the program groups and the familiar icons beneath. And remember how I mentioned my faint memory of Norton Desktop. I was always under the impression that one could create such nested groups in Windows 3.x, and of course I had tried and never succeeded as in fact Windows 3.x doesn't provide this functionality. It's only now that I realized that this was actually the functionality of Norton Desktop which made this possible. I read somewhere that Norton Desktop was compared to MacFinder-like appearance, which when looked at it with some distance, can be considered in a way similar. It can have icons on the desktop to run programs, but also for accessing the drives. It brings its own integrated file browser that is essentially replacing Windows' own file manager. What I did observe though that at least in version 1.0 I ended up in this endless loop on the modal dialog when no media was inserted. It may be bound to running it inside the virtualization here, but I essentially had to reset the VM to recover, as even when inserting a virtual media I couldn't restore to proper mode of operations. Aside from that, Norton Desktop for Windows comes along with a bunch of applications, be it a calculator or Smart Erase, a data recovery tool. I mentioned already it has a scheduler which by default runs a backup every morning at 4 AM. Now, when running Norton Backup the first time, it asks you to set up a default backup set and run an initial calibration. On an earlier occasion, I had been blamed for not running things on native hardware, but at least let me point out that aside from easier screen capturing, running an emulation inside 86box or PCM still gives you the overall performance of a contemporary emulated machine. Like here, on the backup run, the estimated time prediction versus the actual duration was in real time, so in fact the emulation played out the floppy disk access as if it were a real system. Of course, nothing beats real hardware, and there will be some featured later on in today's episode. On a side note, bundling a backup program made totally sense, as at the time in 1991, neither the then current MS-DOS 5 nor Windows 3.x itself came with a backup utility back then. Norton Disk Doctor was also included, although it failed on this version with this message about disk clusters being too large. That's the result of me running an emulated machine with a 2GB virtual hard drive. Typical hard drive sizes in this era were smaller than 500 MB, and thus NDD would have worked on it. We'll see that again in a few moments. Anyways, here's a quick peek at the scheduler program. It also came with a character map program called KeyFinder, which can display the actual decimal, hex or octal values for characters, something that certainly becomes handy for casual programmers. This system information surely also came from the Norton utilities, providing some insights into the system. Aside, there is an icon editor. As someone who ended up using OS2 for 5 years, I always loved the option to customize the program icons, something that was never possible on Windows natively. I like this one. And I furtherly liked this one, Batch Builder. Now, Windows 3.x had a macro recorder, but yeah, macros are unreliable crap, I'm sorry. They only work if the window is in exactly that position where you want to click and it doesn't look on timing and delays. Bah! Batch files had long been available on DOS, so what Symantec did was to implement the batch-like language for Windows. There's an editor, which from today's point of view looks totally archaic. There's no live syntax checking, no type ahead, no nothing. But hey, it's the 90s. At least it has this pop-up help with the command reference. I only hacked this one up very quickly, mostly for a brief non-useful showcase, but as you can see, it allows you to read values into variables like the DOS version. There's even methods to read inputs directly from the user via UI prompts. Using simple control structures, you can either jump to labels using gotos or call other Windows batch files. This is conceptually very much the same as it's done in the DOS batch language. But it goes far beyond, as there's methods for manipulating the Windows clipboard. You can create entire dialog boxes, there's delay functions which may be used when running external programs, and much more. Someone said exploring this may fill an entire video by itself. I perfectly see this and how much more useful this feature actually is as when compared to the Windows macro recorder. Let me know in the comments if I shall do an extended showcase on this particular feature. Another powerful thing is how Norton Desktop allows you to customize the menu. By default, it uses the short menus, showing only the most important features. But not only can you enable the extended menus, but you could even customize them to your liking, like here adding the DOS prompt launcher directly into the menu bar. And here comes version 2 of Norton Desktop. For the most, it's pretty much identical to version 1.0, but it has gained some new abilities. Aside from the batch builder, there's now also macro builder, which is more sophisticated than the Windows 3.x macro recorder. Batch Builder still looks pretty much the same as in the previous version, and so does Norton Disk Doctor, which still doesn't get along with the 2GB FAT16 partition. The most crucial addition in this release was the inclusion of the Norton antivirus. Let's check it out quickly on this compact Presario 425. It took somewhat like 8 minutes to install the product, and I definitely wonder what Norton Desktop says about the hard drive. See, here I have a 256 MB disk partition, which seems no problem for NDD, and it completes just fine on the inspection. In 1993, Symantec released one final release of Norton Desktop for Windows. This one got a bit of an overhaul already in the installer, which looks a little bit more polished than before. The most obvious change was the introduction of a toolbar, and the overall configuration dialog was reworked for a more user-friendly appearance. Furtherly, some of the utilities were replaced by newer versions coming from the Norton utilities, like here a revamped Norton Disk Doctor, which now supports 2 GB FAT16 partitions. Also, Smart Erase was replaced by Norton On Erase, and Speed Disk was now included as well. Batch Builder was replaced by Script Maker, which to me looks like a big step forward as it received many more new commands and also a dialog editor. As mentioned before, there was also a version of Norton Desktop made for DOS. Let's begin with the so-called Starter Edition, and well, what shall I say? At first, one can't neglect the similarity to its Windows UI counterpart. What it adds is the button command bar, which is similar to Norton Commander. That makes sense, so it can call up functions quickly by the F1 to F10 keys in a similar way, if it weren't for the fact that pretty much all useful functions are resulting in this message box here. So aside from the file browser functionality and the bundled Norton antivirus, this version is pretty much useless. It was obviously intended to be bundled with other products as a teaser to motivate people into buying it. And if anything, the pop-ups are not shy in mentioning what you're missing here, like the scheduler, the backup program, yet even the screensavers were left out.
This Starter Edition reminds me of something. If only I could tell what.
One might argue about the latter, but even with this feature here, which seems to be a serial and parallel line transfer function, the kind of which was known from LabLink and other product, was removed. So here's the unrestricted Norton Desktop for DOS, and this one looks much more promising as it comes with On Erase, Speed Disk, Disk Doctor and pretty much everything else missing from the Starter Edition. It does as well have the program groups in a similar way than its Windows counterpart, and it even integrates some of the Windows applications as launcher items. And while it does not provide you with its own batch language, at least a tool called Batch Enhancer is supplied, which adds some additional commands for use in DOS batch files, plus it comes with its own file editor. And as I said, there's also some reminiscence of the Norton Commander, and you can have it mimic Norton Commander somewhat when opening up the file navigator panes. However, it's clearly not intended to use it like the Norton Commander, as the easy pane switching using the tab key doesn't work. And even so it provides the Ctrl-O hotkey to show the underlying DOS prompt, it's not exactly the same either. In the end, I would have loved to look at the Norton Desktop for Macintosh as well. Maybe I cross paths with it one day. The Windows version definitely had its merits, and I would definitely see myself using it in the past. As far as the DOS version is concerned, I don't know. The Starter Edition was for nothing in my opinion, and the full feature product is nice, but I don't know what it was trying to accomplish. With Norton Commander for DOS there was already a very similar product that would be even better suited for navigating with a keyboard. And if I look at this German version of NC 5.51 I have, that even came bundled with the Norton utilities, I can accomplish pretty much the same. Granted, it's less graphical styling and is more text mode oriented, but just to leave an impression here. Or what do you think about it? Let me know in the comments below. I'm the Vintage Collector, and this was my story for today. Thanks for watching, and see you again next Sunday. Next time on the Vintage Collector. It was competing with Symantec's Norton Desktop as a Windows shell replacement. Though I never used it myself, people said it was good. Let's check out the Central Point Desktop for Windows.